Welcome to the StoryPowers Podcast, a show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Billy Samoa Saleebey. Billy is a filmmaker, host of the Inside Out podcast, and founder of Insight Media. And in 2019, he left the corporate world after a successful career at both SolarCity and Tesla. On top of that, Billy is a man full of amazing stories. If you like the show, please subscribe and join my amazing community of listeners. They are the best 7 people you ever meet. Ladies and gentlemen, Billy Samoa Saleebey. Billy, welcome to the show.
Francisco, thank you for the warm introduction. And I'm just thrilled to be here and looking forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
It turns out that you and I have more in common than I first thought. The symbol of your podcast is tattooed on my arm.
Oh my goodness, no way. Oh yeah, I could see that. Okay.
And we both come from somewhat distant Lebanese families, don't we?
Yes, my dad is full-blooded Lebanese. Both his parents were Lebanese, and they actually were born here. So we're third generation, meaning that my great-grandparents came from Lebanon, and so we've been here a long time, but we still really appreciate the ancestry and the heritage, and we have family reunion every other year where we eat Lebanese food. And I don't speak Arabic. Do you speak Arabic yourself? Or
no? We're the same type. I think third generation as well, because it was also my great grandparents, and there was all sorts of weird things with my Lebanese heritage because I ate Lebanese food every Sunday at my grandparents' house, and I thought my grandmother was this amazing cook. And then after she passed, and I was talking about it with my father, and he said, "What you talking about? She didn't cook that food. She ordered it in." And she just didn't allow us to talk about it because she wanted people to think she was a great cook.
Oh my goodness. I love that. That's hilarious. The fact that she kept it from you for that long is impressive in and of itself. But isn't it delicious food? At the very least, you got to appreciate how amazing, and it's healthy too. That's what I love about it. It's not only delicious, but most of it's actually quite healthy. So yeah, I'm a huge fan, and you're getting me hungry. I'm going to go want to eat some Lebanese food after this.
Well, as much as it is healthy and it is tasty, this thing I think will make making my grandmother turn in her grave, because my grandfather sold the house that they lived in for most of their life after she passed, and the house changed owners a few times, and it ended up with a Lebanese fast food chain called Habibs. and it was even more ironic because in that house my grandfather had at least 2 dogs called Habib.
No way. What? Are you kidding me? What are the That's insane. Where is it? Where was their house?
This is in Porto Alegre, which is the southernmost capital of Brazil.
Okay. Wow, man. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but we have other things in common as well. Being that if that's in Brazil, so I have a large part of my family that's from Brazil. My uncle married a Brazilian woman, so all my cousins on that side of the family are Brazilian. In fact, one of my cousins lives in Sao Paulo currently, and so I've been there only once. But yeah, have you? Now I hear Brazilian accent. So tell me, I know you're interviewing me, but is like there's obviously something there because I heard that from the beginning because it's very distinct to me. So where's the Brazilian part?
Well, I grew up in Brazil. I tend to joke that I'm like Jason Bourne without any of the skills, just the passports, because I've got a bunch of nationalities. But effectively, I'm Brazilian.
Yeah.
You know, my parents were from Brazil, and I grew up most of my life in Brazil, other than a very small stint in America. And then, and I've been out of Brazil now for 17 years, 18 years. But effectively, I'm Brazilian. I just don't have a stronger Brazilian accent because I think I learned English from a very young age. And then I lived in the UK for 5 years, and I speak English every single day and have done so for the last sort of 20 years.
Yeah.
So it's gotten slightly softer.
Slightly. I still heard it. Honestly, man, the first thing I thought, I know he's in Barcelona, but I hear the Brazilian, when you speak, I just hear it. It's very distinct to me because my family, I grew up being around them and they would always speak Portuguese. And I picked up on it. I speak very limited Spanish, and obviously there are some parallels, but more than that, it's the body language, it's the way they said it. And I was picking things up just by immersion and just being there and listening to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you only learn as you grow up. I tended to think that I had this flawless English accent. And, if I hadn't learned that wasn't the case, podcasting and having to listen to myself all the time has completely disabused me of that notion.
Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah, when you do listen to yourself, it's a whole nother world. Accent, no accent, heavy accent. Just listening to yourself is always an interesting thing to do, no matter who you are and what your accent is.
And one thing I've had this experience now that I've been doing the podcast for not that long, but I'm a lot more aware of how I speak, at least in this type of context, because as I'm editing the podcast, I realized that my tendency, for example, I don't and ah very much, which a lot of people do, but I tend to jump into the answer before I figured it out what I'm saying. So I'll have false starts. And then I'll repeat the same thing 2 or 3 times before I actually get into my train of thought. So there is the habit, or I'm trying to build this. Someone asks you a question, just shut up for 2 extra seconds and then figure out what the answer is.
It's a great practice. I have the same thing. I say, like I start something and you could hear me say it a word twice. And so I think if you take a pause, think, and then share what you're going to say, it's a lot better than going into it too quickly. But of course, there's also the ahs and the ums. It sounds like you don't have that problem as much. I just did it right there. You don't have that problem as much, and everyone's going to listen to me like, oh, there, he did it again. So I shouldn't have told you, but yeah, you hear those things that you say all the time. You don't even notice, but when you record yourself and then you listen back, then it becomes really clear that you say things in a certain way. It's just your speech pattern.
The problem I have when I'm doing this is that I'm not supposed to just be like a normal person talking in a podcast. I am also supposed to be a professional speaker. And, I've written a book in public speaking, and part of practicing public speaking is that you drum out of your normal speech patterns, things like that. But the reality is that when I'm speaking, those things don't come out because I typically know very well what I'm saying. I'm not thinking of what I'm saying every time I say it. So although they doesn't really happen when I'm speaking in public, if I'm just having a normal conversation, then, you're still just like a normal person. You might be slightly more eloquent when you get into the rhythm of what you're saying, but it still takes a while to figure out what you're going to say. No, doesn't make a fast thinker.
I'm with you. Yeah, if you're thinking on your feet and you're having to come up with what you're going to say immediately, the way in which you orate that or say that is going to be different than if you've practiced, if you've polished, if you know very well, especially if it's a presentation or a talk you've given multiple times, you're going to own it, right? It's almost like you are on autopilot. You ever drive a car and you get from point A to point B without remembering driving? The reason why is your subconscious is doing it. And I think that happens sometimes when you're on stage or you're speaking. At least for me, you've owned it. If you've done it enough times, either by practice or by literally having done it many, many times, it just comes so naturally to you. And so you're not thinking and speaking at the same time, which can cause some of those things that you're mentioning.
It's one of the biggest myths of public speaking that if you sound unnatural, if you sound robotic, is because you are too rehearsed. When the answer really, and anyone that's ever done any acting would know, is you just haven't rehearsed enough. Because once you know exactly what you're saying, you don't have to think about it. So you can interact with the audience better. You can figure out, this type of humor is not landing very well. Maybe I should adjust that other thing I was going to say. And you get the vibe of the audience a lot more. Whereas if you're thinking, oh, what's the next line again? Oh, I'm supposed to move into a story now, but which is the story I was going to tell? If you're doing that, that's when you sound tentative and not very convincing. Whereas if you know dead to rights what the speech is, then you feel free to move around with it. So I guess with anything that has become automatic, that's just one of those that with practice you get better, but improvising is not usually the way to go about it.
Well, if you have to think of what the word is or what you're going to say next, yeah, you've missed the whole objective of what I call relentless practice, which is practicing until you own it so much that you're not thinking about what you're saying, you're thinking about how you're saying it. Meaning, are you going to have a pause at a certain point to convey even more meaning and to draw their attention? Or are you going to sit down at a certain point? Or are you going to have a certain type of body language during a certain part of your speech? Those are the things that you should be thinking about. And to your other point, interaction or being able to read the audience and know if you need to make a slight change or do something else. That's the type of thing that you should be focused on. Not, are you going to say the words? The words should just be there already. And again, you're right. It's got to be practiced over and over again. You've under rehearsed.
You had before the podcast and before starting Insight Media, which we'll talk about a bit later on, but just help me understand, how did it work from what seemed to be a very successful career in the sort of sales and training space with SolarCity and Tesla? How do you go from that to doing what you're doing now, which is, I know the podcast side. I'm not so clear on what else the Insight Media company entails.
Yeah. Well, look, I never intended to get into corporate world at all. My entire life, if you had asked me as a kid, I always wanted to be a business owner, an entrepreneur. I wanted to do amazing things. And what happened was I ended up doing amazing things with amazing companies, but it happened by accident. And when I say that, what I mean is prior to working for SolarCity and Tesla, I'd made a movie. And so I spent 7 years of my life writing, directing, producing a feature film. The film, it did well. It got picked up for distribution. It won multiple film festivals, and it was an amazing, amazing project. But as I said, it was 7 years. And so anytime you spend 7 years of your life on anything, you got to ask yourself, what was the return on investment? And I'll be honest, the return on investment was I didn't make 7 years worth of income off of that film, despite its success. And it did have millions of viewers. It was on Netflix and Amazon. I mean, amazing things happened with that film. Flash forward to 2009. Now the film's got distribution. And I found myself helping my brother with a promo video for his solar business. He was a sales consultant. And he told me about how you can help people go solar, put solar panels on their roof. They pay less for electricity and it doesn't cost the homeowner anything. I'm like, wow, that's an amazing thing. And so I said, well, maybe I should do this. And so I got started in sales totally by accident because I wanted to see if I could be good at it. Luckily, I was really good at it and moved up the corporate ladder. And what I call it is the wave, lasted a really long time. And so, yeah, I went from being a salesperson to being a manager, from a manager to being in training, from being in training to being the head of training, from being the head of training to be the head of sales. And then I left that company I got recruited to go to SolarCity and had an amazing run at SolarCity where I ended up running all of sales training for SolarCity. That then led to Tesla. And Tesla, I mean, who could imagine working for this company, right? I sort of backdoored my way into Tesla. It's harder to get in there than it is to Harvard. And so of course, I'm not going to leave when I get a role at Tesla. And so I started, my first role there was doing onboarding. So I created Launch, which is the new hire training for anyone that starts at Tesla. And that then led to me leading all of sales training for Tesla. That's vehicle, energy, and everything. And all of product training was on my team as well. And so I said, wow, this is an amazing opportunity. I have to take it. And so I took that opportunity. But as things transpired, it was last year now, beginning of last year, Elon Musk, he's a visionary. And his vision obviously is to do some incredible things. My boss reported to him. And so the decision was made that I had a global role. My global role, I led a team in Europe, a team in Asia, a team in North America. He didn't want a global leader overseeing all of those people because there was individual managers in each of those markets. And so I could have stayed at Tesla, I'm certain, but I couldn't have stayed at Tesla in that role. And so I felt my time was done. And I was using that as an opportunity because like I said, I've always wanted to start my own thing. And so flash forward to today, you ask about Insight Media. And so, the story's still being told. But what I realized at Tesla is people learn when they have insights, when they have a moment where they have a light bulb go off and something clicks for them. It's not when something clicks for the trainer. The trainer, it's already clicked for. So how do we create insights in the people that are immersing themselves in training, who are listening to podcasts, who are watching videos? And so you do that by entertaining and educating. And so the blend of entertainment and education is what Insight Media is all about. I had the film background, I had the training background, and now I'm blending those two to create experiences. So I'm building out 2 courses, one on podcasting, one on LinkedIn. I have my podcast. I'm actually starting another podcast very soon, which I'll share some of the details on that very soon. And my vision for the company is to help people who are starting their journey and who are starting their journey to make their mark on the world. And I just really fundamentally believe that true change comes when people who have heart and passion and an uncompromising desire to do something special while they're here, those are the type of people that I want to surround myself with. And I want to give them as much as I could give them from what I've learned, from my experience in leadership, from my experience in podcasting, from my experience as a filmmaker, from my experience being on LinkedIn and growing what I've grown on LinkedIn. And so that's where we're at today with Insight Media.
I have a couple of questions just to close the loop on Tesla. The first one is that it must be a bit annoying to have Elon Musk as kind of your boss, because you can't really second guess him a great deal, right? You don't go home and say, oh, my boss is an asshole. He doesn't know anything. I mean, he just doesn't know how these things work.
Well, that's funny. You can go home and say that, but you also can't do what you just said, which is you can't second guess him and assume you'll still have a job. And that's just the reality of it. I don't share this often in public or on a show. So I will share a little bit what I'll call more of the inner workings. And I had a very special role in being a director at the most disruptive company in modern times. And when I say being a director there, why that's important is there's very few people at director and above level, around 200 or so, maybe 250 at the most. Talking at the time I was there as a 60,000 person organization. So Elon believed in a very flat organization, meaning not a whole lot of manager buffer. He'd rather have big teams of people and fewer managers. So you're right, though. Second guessing Elon is just not something you do. And it's not just you don't do it because he has the best ideas or he's the only one that's right. You don't do it because, frankly, you don't want to lose your job. And when I say that, I want to make it clear that it's not that everybody who ever second guessed him lost their job. It's the type of second guessing that would potentially allow you to lose your job. What Elon doesn't like, what he absolutely loathes, are excuses. And making excuses for things that shouldn't be excused. An example, if there is something like delivery was an important time of year. Delivery happened 4 times a year. It was the end of quarter. And every time, everyone, and I mean everyone, would go to the delivery hubs and the delivery centers and help with getting cars into customers' hands. And so it was a very tense time because this is when we made or didn't make our quarter. And this is quarterly earnings are a huge deal. And so we wanted to get as much revenue realized as possible. You get revenues realized when the car's in the customer's hands. And so as an example, if we go through and we would have conference calls and he'd be on the call and he would ask questions, and to his credit, like lots of questions that people would answer. There were times when people would say, oh, we couldn't do this because of this specific reason. Like we couldn't find parking spaces for the cars. Okay, well, why couldn't you find parking spaces for the cars? They didn't exist. Well, in Elon's mind, that's simply not true. There always will be a way to find parking spaces for the vehicles if you are resourceful, if you work hard enough, if you're a badass. And when you don't do that, and when you make an excuse, that could, and in many cases did, end up being the end of your journey. And so, yeah, you have to be mindful of that. But I mean, I'm so honored to have worked for him. Is he a perfect leader? No. But, and this is a huge but, you can't underestimate the vision that he has, where he's looking 200-300 years in the future, maybe even further. He's not looking at next month. And that's why I think it's hard to be a leader of a publicly traded company that's constantly trying to show off quarterly earnings. To him, that's meaningless. He's looking at the bigger picture. He's thinking about colonizing Mars and creating, serious change to allow us to be sustainable. And so it was an interesting journey, man. I'll tell you that.
The second question I had, and I think that helps me bring it back from Tesla and Elon back to you, is I've listened to him a couple of times at the Joe Rogan show. So these are very long interviews, 2-3 hours, and they're drinking. So, his inhibitions are down, too down, as the stockholders would think sometimes.
For sure.
But the thing that I found very, very interesting and also very difficult for someone who was in your position is, it's not that he's just a very smart guy. It's not that his intelligence is above what a lot of us will deal with on a day-to-day basis. Is that his brain just does not function, or doesn't seem to function from the outside the way most people's do. So when you're talking in your show, you're talking about finding those breakthrough moments in people's lives. And I have the distinct feeling that whatever people can learn from your show and from studying breakthrough moments, I have my doubt about how much of that would apply to Elon, or how much the breakthrough moments in his life would be universal and universal lessons to everyone else. But then again, perhaps you don't think 200 or 300 years ahead of time if you just think like everyone else.
Yeah. So here's the thing about him. Well, one, I think he is absolutely smarter than your average person. 100%, like literally just intelligence, intellect, brain power. Okay. But let's set that aside. To your point, like it that's probably not the only thing. There's got to be something else, because there's smart people out there. What I think Elon has is he has a perfect blend of understanding a lot of different things very well. For example, he's a big believer in something called first principles thinking. And what that effectively means is most people, if they're going to design or build or create something, they look at something that already exists that's similar to that. So let's take a car, for example, or a rocket, either one. Rockets existed before Elon started SpaceX. Cars existed before he started Tesla. So he doesn't come in and say, I want to build a car. Okay, then I'm going to look at all the cars that exist and I'm just going to make them better. I'm going to take all the knowledge that exists currently and I'm going to make them better. No, he's going to deconstruct everything. He's going to boil them down to their fundamental truths. What are our limiting factors? And the only limiting factors that exist would be the laws of physics, things that you can't change. And he knows the laws of physics. He knows them very, very well. He's got an engineering brain, but he's also got this brain that allows him to think about, well, why do I need to build a car like Toyota built it, or whoever else, Ford, or whoever else? And so the materials you use, how you put them together, all of the inner workings of the way the car is. I mean, if you look at the Model X and you look at the big, in front of the driver and the passengers, the window there, drawing a blank on what's that called, but
whatever you call it,
yeah,
I'll just believe you.
Yeah, no, I want to say windscreen, but in front of the vehicle,
the cockpit or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it expands way further than any other car, and that's just one example. Because what he does is he says what absolutely has to be, and therefore we know we're going to do that. But other than that, anything's on the table. And so we're not reasoning by analogy, by looking at other people or other things or other products. We are building from the ground up, no matter what we're doing. And so this mindset, I think, is a key factor in his success. Same thing happened with SpaceX, right? He went in and he looked and he said, well, people are trying to sell rockets. He was going to buy a rocket, but it was too expensive. The rocket didn't make sense to buy. So he said, okay, well, what are the supplies you need to buy rockets? So he went out and bought the supplies he needs and he built his own rockets. And now look at what he's done. I mean, that type of thinking, I think, is truly key when we think about why Elon has had the success he's had, remembering to break things down and not just assume that everything that's existed before has been done the right way. That's just the way it's existed before.
I got this thing on WhatsApp the other day, and I think that comes to prove your point that the things that were done before are perhaps not done right. So this was trying to describe some problem that rockets seem to have of why they are a certain width or some of the dimension of how you build a rocket. Why was it that way always? And they were saying, well, it's that way always because the company that provides it is from Russia. And to get it out of where they make it to the rest of Europe, it needs to go through this tunnel. And this tunnel has a certain width. So they can't make a rocket any bigger than that because you won't go through the tunnel. Why is the tunnel that size? Well, because it was the trains used to go through that tunnel. Why are the trains that size? And then it kept coming back to, the asses of two horses. The whole thing came back to this is what, two horses' asses set aside measured. And that was the trains and the cars. And now it's influencing how everyone, perhaps except Elon Musk, builds their space rockets. So
what a perfect analogy though, Francisco. I'm telling you that right there is the quintessential example of why we shouldn't assume. If you just keep asking questions, why do you do it that way? Why do you do it that way? Why do you do that? When you get back to it, it's probably the dumbest reason ever why you do it that way. And so you shouldn't just assume you need to do it that way because your great grandmother, had, she was missing a leg and therefore she had to stand a certain way. Like it's just the most random things that make us do the things that we've done. And, I'll tell you a quick story. The Tesla factory is fantastic. It's one of the most incredible things to observe and witness, all of this orchestration of human beings and robotics building these vehicles. Like I had the opportunity to go on many, many tours, both private and part of group tours. I've probably been on more tours than most people because of my role and the different jobs that I had there. And it was an amazing, amazing time. One of the things that happened was when they built it, they knew they had to have this huge, what's basically it molds the parts of the car it's a press and it presses them extremely high pressure to form the different pieces of the vehicle. And so this press was in Michigan. It was at another car factory in Michigan, and they had to get it to California. And so he asked the company that built this, it's called the Schuler press. He asked the company Schuler, what would it cost for them to bring it out there? And it was going to cost more to bring it from Michigan to California than to actually buy this piece of equipment. I mean, we're talking huge, massive, like 7 stories and just huge. And they had to break it up. So what Elon did instead of hiring this company is he tasked his engineers and his most bright problem solvers to come up with a solution. How will they get this piece of machinery from Michigan to California? And so they spent a fair amount of time figuring out how they would do it. Ultimately, what they realized is the reason why it was going to cost so much is we're talking, this was 7 stories. There was probably about, call it a yard, maybe a meter, even less than that, half a meter of this machinery that wouldn't fit on all of the transport, the vehicles and through almost like what you said, through the tunnel, it wouldn't fit. And so they actually, instead of kind of doing something revolutionary, they had to cut part of it off and then they put it back together. But this allowed them to get it from point A to point B at a fraction of the cost that they would have had to pay if they paid the company. And so these types of solutions, they can be found all around us if we just look for them and if we don't make assumptions that things have to be a certain way.
I think it's interesting that you use this analogy of getting from point A to point B in an easier way and a faster way, because that's an engineering approach, and it's very much not the approach you were taking with your podcast. So I've listened to a few episodes, including the one with your dad, who I'm still struggling to understand how that man was ever a hippie that would name you Samoa. But you've gone for a sort of longer form style of podcast, and you are in no hurry whatsoever to get people's story out of them. So when you were trying to decide, coming from the background you've come from, it would have been perhaps normal to assume that you'd ask 10 questions, get to some major breakthrough moment, pick that one apart, and that would be the core of what you're doing. But you've done the opposite. So why was that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm still not sure it's the right approach. It may or may not be. I believe in testing and I believe in trying different things. I'm a curious person. I like to know why somebody is a certain way, not just that they had an insight or a moment in their life, but I want to understand why the person is who they are. And I think in order for that to come through, you have to ask questions about their story, about their past, about their childhood, about their career moments. And so that being said, it may be better to do a short form. What I do fundamentally believe is podcasting and audio forms of communication are the future, because people want something that they could listen to while they're doing other things, while they're walking, while they're working out, while they're going to work, commuting, whatever. And so what's beautiful about having a long form podcast is you could then cut it up into smaller pieces. And so if you have that content, then you can use it to share in different ways, either through video or shorter forms of audio. And so I'm interested in knowing about the people. So I ask those questions. And so, I'm not Joe Rogan length, but my show is longer and some episodes are longer than others. I am working actually to keep episodes a little bit shorter without compromising what I feel is the heart, which is understanding them as a human being.
Something that I just thought about this. I hadn't really thought about this when I was listening to your show or preparing this. It's that it could be argued that your approach is significantly more like what a story does to our brain than, for example, my show, when I'm talking about stories and I'm talking about storytelling. And the reason I say that is because one of the most interesting bits of science from storytelling is that the brain doesn't do very well separating what's imagined or told or lived. So anyone that has ever looked into sports psychology would know that people like the Chicago Bulls 25 years ago used to do visualization exercises to get better at the game. I think Phil Jackson brought that in. And the brain doesn't know the difference. If you practice free throws in your head, the brain is practicing free throws. It doesn't matter that you're not doing physically. And stories do the same thing. So there's this cool studies that have done where they plugged a whole bunch of stuff to people's brains, and then they talked about the senses. So they talked about smells and tastes, and the exact same area of your brain lights up as if you were smelling something, or as if you were listening to something or tasting something. And it's as specific that if I tell you about how I was playing football and then someone stepped on my right foot, the part of your brain that controls the right foot will light up. So it's this very immersive thing. And the reason I'm talking about this in relation to your podcast is because I think that long form podcasts, when you are allowing someone to talk a lot and to describe their life or parts of their life a lot, makes us live that to a certain degree. Whereas if it's just a give and take, perhaps you don't have that as much. There's some parts of your father's story, for example, that I can relate to, but you just end up with a much bigger feel for the person and for the life they've led by having that much time with them.
Yeah.
And as you said, as the two of you said, there was a focused conversation. We don't have those conversations. We don't talk to our friends or our family for an hour and a half, almost ever. So, I mean, I thought it was very interesting.
Well, first, thank you. And what I'll say is, we ended that, and I don't know if you got to the end of that one yet, but the way that ends is my dad actually says that was one of the best conversations we've ever had. And what's fascinating about that is if you knew how strong the relationship is with my father, that would mean even more. It's not like this is a person I don't know very well. I know him very well. He knows me very well. We have a wonderful relationship and friendship and have always had just a very tight relationship. But we did explore things and have a deep conversation for an extended period of time. And yeah, you do sort of live it when you have that amount of time to really talk about these things. And you really get to know people in a different way than if it is almost too fast. And so the other thing I'll comment on is this piece about visualization, because I think it's really important to think about the power of our mind and how it really processes ideas, thoughts. I was talking to my son or my wife and my son yesterday, who we were talking about dreams. And my son had a dream. He goes, I can't remember if it was real or not. And my wife said she also experienced that phenomenon recently as well, which is sometimes you have dreams that are so vivid, you can't actually remember if it was real life or not. And when you think about visualization, the beautiful part about that is you can wire your brain to begin to think about things that are upcoming and begin to manifest it. This is why thoughts are things. This is why the law of attraction is real. If you think about something enough, if your brain keeps playing through over and over and over again, something that you want, something that you are going to live, you will in fact live it. And it's through your brain being conditioned to make this a reality and to where it becomes real. I think the biggest gating issue we have as human beings is we stop ourselves. We have fear. And it's that fear, it's that uncertainty, it's that doubt that prevents us from doing what we want in life. And so part of my mission and my goal when working with new people is to help them rewire their brain to prevent themselves from stopping themselves, because we all do it and it's just a natural instinct. We stop ourselves because if you think evolutionarily speaking, we human beings, we're here for a reason. We lasted as long as we did because we didn't take significant risks. We took calculated risks and we put ourselves in safe places and we avoided places that we were afraid of that pretty much put us in danger. And so now we're in this world where there's not as many things that put us in danger and we still have this natural instinct to prevent us from doing things. We need to dampen that part of our brain to allow ourselves to expand and to shine.
You talked about risks now, and you had talked about the wave of your career before. And one accusation that is often leveled at people that are sort of in the coaching space is that there's a lot of theory, but not a great deal of practice. One thing I don't think anyone could accuse you of is not being someone who takes risks, because after 7 years of your life not earning as much money as perhaps you should have for the energy spent in a documentary about ecstasy, you went into the corporate world and then you decided to ditch that to go back on your own and do something which is, by any accounts, a lot riskier, at least from a financial point of view, certainly a lot riskier. So, at least on that side, you are walking the walk. Nobody can accuse you of not doing what you're preaching.
I appreciate that. And, it's interesting because when we think about risk in life, and you only have one life. And so everything you do to some degree is a risk. And when I left corporate life, yeah, it was comfortable. I'm not going to lie. It was hard. It was challenging. I worked for 4 years of my life felt like decades. I'm not kidding. That's how long it felt like I worked at SolarCity and Tesla. And so probably that's one of the reasons I walked away from corporate life. And I've had lots of opportunities, lots of job offers, lots of opportunities. When you work at Tesla, it does open a lot of doors. I'm not going to lie. But I realized that for me to be most happy, I wanted to have the most control over what I was doing and what I was contributing to the world. And so to me, it doesn't feel like a risk. It feels like it would be more of a risk to go back and do something that I'm comfortable in and do something that I know I could do. I could lead sales organization and training organizations and have a nice career and just have a 9 to 6, 9 to 7 job where I'm going in and doing my thing. But the risk there is I look back and I say, why didn't I do something else? Why didn't I do what I always wanted to do? And so to me, I feel like I'm living what I meant to do right now at this point in my life, just like I felt like I was living to do what I did at SolarCity, at Tesla, and making the film. That was the right thing then. This is the right thing now. And so to me, the greater risk is doing something that you don't believe in and that you're not passionate about.
You touched on the answer, I think, but let me just understand this a little bit better. Because with your experience where you were, and obviously what that adds to your curriculum, perhaps it's just how my brain works, but to me, one of the obvious approaches you could have taken to get your message out, to have a lot more control of what you're doing, was to become more of a speaker, or at least have the speaking side of whatever you do to be more the leading part and the podcast to be more of a supporting part. Now, you did touch on earlier, you said that you think that audio and things like podcasts are the future. So just talk me through when you decided to go down the route you're going down now, what made you think, okay, a podcast will be the driving vehicle of this fleet?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think there are a few things that went into it. One, I believe that the speaking, and believe me, I love speaking. And so I want to rap with you more about that because it's something that I'm passionate about. Current situation has made it near impossible to do that. So it's funny you say that because I just took speaker off of my website, specifically not because I'm not a speaker, but because I'm not currently speaking. So I would say, even though podcast has been the driver, I think speaking is on par with that, and where I see long-term, where I see a good percentage of my time being. I also recognize that speaking has its own share of demands, travel, preparing. When I speak, and I've had several speaking engagements since I left Tesla, I don't take it lightly. I practice, I prepare, and it takes a long time. Now, once I have a few presentations done, then I could just recycle those. But as I've built those, I have a few now that I've built since leaving Tesla, then I feel like I could do more and more of them. But I also recognize that the time commitment to do them is considerable. And so the driving force for the podcast now is that we live in a world where I not only think that, the speaking part of what I want to do is on hold, at least temporarily. I also believe that there are more people going into podcasting and using that as a medium than ever before, even though there's not people commuting. So there's maybe some reduction in overall listenership. I think there's an increase in people doing podcasts. And so I want to support those people. I don't claim to be a podcasting expert. I've been doing it since September of last year, but I've learned a lot and I continue to learn. And so if somebody's just getting started, I'm happy to help them. I'm happy to give them at least some of the knowledge that I've gained in the time that I've been doing this. And so as my knowledge increases and expands and grows, I can only provide even more knowledge and experience to those that are interested and those that want to learn. And so I love learning and I love helping other people learn. And so I think that's at the cornerstone of what I'm doing. Podcasting is the medium, but ultimately I'm helping people learn and grow and enrich their lives.
I obviously cannot knock that you're giving anyone advice having been podcasting since September, because I've been giving people advice and I've been podcasting for a month. And my main advice is don't buy a Blue Yeti. That's the main advice, because you don't realize how good those things are. And then your daughter will never shut up. Doesn't matter if she's 50 meters away in the house, you will hear her singing. So get something a little simpler and your problems are solved. At least my problems were solved by a significantly simpler and less powerful mic than what I went for originally.
I totally relate. I had a condenser mic, which picks up a lot of sound. And then I switched to the Shure SM7B, and not to get too technical, but it's a dynamic microphone. And one of the beautiful things about it is my studio's near a somewhat busy street. And so the dynamic microphone, it doesn't pick up all that noise. And so having a microphone, understanding the environment you're in, understanding the type of noises that could come into play should dictate the type of equipment you use, and finding something that's going to give you the sound richness that you want while also not potentially getting too much background noise that causes things that you don't want in your show. So I love it, man. And teach. The more you learn, the more you can teach. The more you teach, the more you learn. It's such an interesting circle that it is.
An interesting point that has been raised now by your comments on speaking, because you said, the demands on time and travel and all of that. And I agree with you. And I also agree with you with the problems of being a speaker now, because I was at the point of launching sort of internationally as a speaker, and I still had stuff to do, but it was all on its way. And now obviously that's on hold. And I'm still debating to some degree, how much do I want to go and invest to become a virtual speaker, and how much do I want to just bide my time, brand build, work on my material so that when things start coming back, I can jump at it. But one thing that James Taylor, who's been on the podcast and is someone I work with on the business side of the speaking, mentioned is that he was very busy as a keynote speaker. I think last year he had done 52 engagements, and he keeps track of his miles. And he says, the one thing I never wanted to think about was the impact on the planet of how much all this speaking, all this speaking does. And he's very happy with the fact that now things are obviously almost all virtual and are likely to remain a lot more virtual for the foreseeable future, because he says, I can do the same number of engagements with a tenth of the travel, and I can do other things with my time, which means I'll probably end up earning the same. So this is something worth considering, perhaps for the two of us, which is a lot of the demands of speaking that perhaps will put people off from having that as the main thing in their career can now be eliminated or at least reduced if the virtual thing stays past the worst of the pandemic, which I think a lot of it will, because lower cost, a lot easier.
Yeah, no, and a great point. And it's going to be a while before we get to a point where it's on par with what existed prior to all this happening. So I think coming up with ways in which you can get your message out, have more opportunities is always advisable. And so I'm speaking in a couple weeks, and I think that will likely lead to other speaking engagements. And so virtually, of course. And yeah, I think let's leverage technology. We shouldn't assume that you're not have opportunity simply because it's changed. And so I think you bring up a really, really good point, which is the new world is here. We might as well embrace it instead of avoid it.
Yes, and I very much agree with all of that. And I'm mindful of your time because we're coming up to a hard stop. So before we we have to pull the plug, let me just ask where people can find more about you and the stuff you're doing.
So the number one way to find me is to find me on LinkedIn. And the reason why I say LinkedIn is I want to connect with anyone that is interested in my story and the work that I do. And so send me a connection request. I'm happy to accept. And that's the first place. The second place is I have a couple websites and of course the podcast. So the podcast is anywhere. It's just called Insight Out. The podcast website is insightoutshow.com. And then my personal website is just my first and middle name, Billy.
I'll stick that all of that in the show notes.
Perfect. No. Okay. BillySamoa.com. So yeah. So, but yeah. So I mean, aside from that, I love meeting people. I love learning about people. And so send me a connection request, put a note in there, and let me know who you are.
Perfect. Billy, this has been great fun. It was a very different conversation than I perhaps originally thought, but more for the better. I think we should go where the conversation leads.
Absolutely. Well, no, it's been enjoyable having this opportunity. I want to learn more about you and about all the things that you're doing with speaking, and just grateful for the opportunity to share my story. And you're doing amazing work. And I could tell you care deeply about people and their stories. And I think that shines through on your show. So Francisco, really appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until next time.